My name is James Rohn. A billionaire spent 6 years and 12 doctors trying to fix her daughter's deafness. Then a security guard making $16 an hour looked at the girl for 3 seconds and said someone had done this to her on purpose. For 8 years, Vanessa Whitmore believed she understood her daughter's world completely. Laya had been diagnosed profoundly deaf at just 2 years old, examined by 12 different specialists, each one confirming the same devastating verdict. Vanessa had learned to grieve quietly, to hold her composure in boardrooms and hospital corridors alike, because that was what powerful women did when the world handed them something they couldn't fix. She had accepted the unacceptable, the way people eventually accept things they're told by every credentialed voice in the room. But acceptance, it turned out, was built on a foundation that had never been properly examined. The night everything changed began at an ordinary charity gala, the kind Whitmore Global hosted every year for children's medical research. Logan Pierce was working temporary security that evening, a job that paid $16 an hour and covered his son's school lunches. He wasn't supposed to notice anything beyond his assigned corridor. But when he found an 8-year-old girl hiding behind a potted plant, clearly frightened and completely unaware that anyone was near her, something in his training kicked in. He'd spent years around military communications equipment, and when the light caught something small and metallic tucked deep in her ear canal, his body recognized it before his mind fully processed what he was seeing. What followed was a confrontation no one expected. Vanessa, initially furious that a stranger had approached her daughter, found herself listening to a security guard describe something impossible. A foreign object, electronic components, something that had no business being inside a child's ear. She wanted to dismiss it, wanted to protect the fragile stability she'd built around her daughter's diagnosis. But something in Logan's calm certainty stopped her from walking away. A retired otolaryngologist attending the gala confirmed it within minutes. There was, unmistakably, something manufactured lodged in Laya's ear canal, positioned so deep that no standard examination would ever have found it. What emerged hours later during emergency surgery was smaller than a pencil eraser, yet dense with internal circuitry that stunned even the biomedical engineers called in to examine it. This wasn't a birth defect or a medical mystery. It was manufactured, deliberate, and hidden with precision. The truth, once investigators dug into it, was worse than anyone imagined. A former nanny who had worked in the Whitmore household years earlier had connections to an unlicensed practitioner operating under rotating identities, a man who preyed on wealthy, frightened families. The device had been planted not to harm Laya directly, but to obscure a timeline, to make sure no doctor would ever connect a nanny's departure to a child's sudden, unexplained hearing loss. It was liability protection disguised as fate. 6 years of Laya's life, 6 years of silence and isolation, had been engineered by people who saw a vulnerable family and exploited it. And it had taken one overlooked security guard, standing where he had no obligation to notice anything at all, to unravel it. Removing the device was only the beginning. Doctors warned that suppression of this severity, years of a hidden signal jamming the nerve pathways in Laya's ear, meant no one could predict how much hearing she'd actually recover, or how fast. Her audiologist, Dr. Nair, had spent 4 years certain of a diagnosis that turned out to be built on false evidence. Now she faced a child whose brain had spent 6 formative years learning to discard sound entirely, and there was no existing playbook for undoing that kind of damage. Logan stepped into the gap almost by accident. Vanessa, watching her daughter cling to a man she'd known for less than 2 weeks, made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She asked him to be part of the recovery process directly. What she didn't know yet was that Logan carried expertise no resume could capture. His late wife had suffered a traumatic brain injury that damaged her auditory processing, and for 2 years before she died, he had studied everything he could find about how the brain remaps sound, not as an academic exercise, but as an act of desperate love with nowhere else to put itself. He proposed something unconventional. Instead of starting Laya's rehabilitation with acoustic input the standard way, they would build on what she already possessed. 6 years of reading vibration, 6 years of translating physical sensation into meaning. He brought in a $15 hand drum and a homemade resonance board, built in his garage with his 7-year-old son handing him tools. Session by session, tap by tap, He and Laya developed a wordless language of rhythm and pattern that slowly, carefully, began bridging the gap between touch and sound. Progress was not linear. There were sessions where Laya shut down entirely, overwhelmed by a world suddenly flooded with meaningless noise. There were nights she crept into her mother's room at 2 a.m., terrified by the hum of an HVAC system she'd never had to process before. But there were also breakthroughs that stunned everyone watching, moments when she tilted her head toward a hummed tone, when she pressed her cheek to a vibrating board with her eyes closed, listening with her whole body in a way that had no clinical name. The breakthrough came without warning, on an ordinary Thursday during a session focused on acoustic anchoring. Laya pressed her hands to her own throat, gathered herself the way she always did before communicating something important, and produced a word. Not a sound, not an approximation. A real word, imperfect at the edges, but unmistakably intentional. Mom. Behind the observation glass, Vanessa collapsed to her knees, undone by 6 years of grief, finally releasing it once. It was the first time sound had ever left her daughter's mouth aimed at another person, chosen deliberately, out of everything Laya could have said, because it was the one that mattered most. What began as one child's recovery became something much larger. Vanessa allocated $12 million from her family's philanthropic fund to build a dedicated pediatric auditory research program around the methodology Logan had developed, not from clinical training, but from grief, instinct, and 2 years of research he'd once had nowhere to put. The board resisted. One member in particular, Chester Aldrich, pushed back hard, arguing that a man who'd been working temporary security for $14 an hour had no business leading a clinical program. Vanessa didn't flinch. She reminded the entire room that credentials and competence were not the same thing, and that the only reason any of them were having this conversation was because Logan had noticed something 13 specialists had missed. The program grew fast. Within weeks, other children arrived, each with their own history of being failed by systems that ran out of patience before they ran out of possibility. A 5-year-old who shut down at the sight of medical equipment. A 9-year-old who communicated only through prepared notes. An 11-year-old, furious and guarded, who slowly let his walls down not because Logan promised things would get easier, but because Logan told him the truth instead. Logan sat in on every intake, not because it was his official role, but because his read on a child's readiness was more accurate than any standard assessment. When a journalist article turned Logan into an unwanted headline, Billionaire's daughter cured by security guard, both Logan and Vanessa moved quickly to correct the framing, insisting the story belonged to the entire clinical team and the families who'd shown up every day under frightening, uncertain circumstances. The attention brought hundreds of inquiries from desperate families across the country, transforming a small pilot program into something that would need to be formalized, licensed, and taught to clinicians everywhere. Underneath all of it, something quieter had been building between Logan and Vanessa, unhurried and unannounced. It showed in the coffee she started making exactly the way she'd watched him drink it, in the phone calls that stopped being strictly about work, in her daughter drawing pictures with Logan standing beside her mother, not behind her, deliberately placed. When Vanessa finally said it plainly, that whatever this was between them mattered too much to leave unspoken, Logan admitted he'd been waiting for the right moment to say the same thing. By the time the foundation held its public launch, 42 families filled the room, with over 400 more still waiting for a spot. Vanessa stood before them and said the truest thing she'd learned all year. Expertise mattered, but attention was the thing no system could manufacture. It had taken one person, in one corridor, choosing to look twice. That choice had changed everything, and the work, imperfect, ongoing, and entirely worth doing, would simply continue. If this story moved you, hit subscribe, because next week's story might just be the one that stays with you longer than this one did.